What if a single night of injustice, a moment of brutal violence under cover of a police raid, became the crucible that forged a new kind of power? What if a young woman, beaten and left for dead, rose from the ashes of that trauma to hold the very system that failed her accountable? The air in the small, quiet apartment was thick with the scent of old books and late-night coffee. Aisha Thorne, a brilliant, determined Black American law student in her early 20s, was poring over case law, preparing for her final exams. Her journey to law school had been a long and difficult one, a triumph of grit and intellect over circumstance. She was a scholar, a dreamer, and a fierce advocate for her community, a community that in her city was often overlooked and over-policed. She had no idea that the very forces she was training to fight were about to violently burst through her front door. For more gripping tales from the hidden corners of justice and beyond, subscribe to Dark Side of Luna, where the shadows hold the truth. The peace was shattered by the thunderous crash of the front door being splintered from its frame. The sounds of boots and shouted commands filled the air. A police raid. Aisha, heart pounding, scrambled to her feet, her hands raised, her voice trembling. "What is this? I live here. What's going on?" Two officers, Officer Miller and Officer Jenkins, both in tactical gear, stormed in, their faces hidden behind masks, their demeanor aggressive. "Down on the ground now," Miller bellowed. Aisha, terrified, complied, but a misplaced book on the floor caused her to stumble, delaying her fall by a fraction of a second. That fraction of a second was all Miller needed. "Resisting," he snarled. Before Aisha could even register what was happening, Miller's heavy boots slammed into her side, a sickening, brutal kick that sent a searing pain through her body. She cried out, collapsing onto the floor. Jenkins, meanwhile, was roughly searching the small apartment, tossing books and papers aside, finding nothing. The raid was a bust, a brutal mistake based on a false tip. Miller stood over her, his boots still hovering over her ribs. "You should have cooperated, girl. Things go a lot smoother when you listen." He and Jenkins exchanged a look. "Nothing here," Jenkins grunted. With no apology, no assistance, they left the apartment in a state of chaos. Aisha on the floor, bruised, battered, and trembling in pain, her dreams of justice shattered by a reality far more cruel than she had ever imagined. The next few hours were a blur of pain, fear, and shame. But as the sun rose, casting a pale light through her broken front door, Aisha's tears of fear turned to a cold, hard resolve. They had tried to break her, but they had not succeeded. They had given her a reason to fight. She would not just heal, she would rebuild. She would finish law school. She would become a lawyer. And she would hold the entire system that had violated her accountable, no matter how long it took. Her pain would become her purpose. Her rage would fuel her justice. And she would not stop until she had justice, not just for herself, but for every other person who had ever been beaten, abused, and left for dead by a system that was supposed to protect them. The next few weeks were a crucible of pain, both physical and emotional. Aisha, despite her injuries, refused to be a victim. She meticulously documented her bruises with her phone, took photos of her ransacked apartment, and wrote down every shouted word from the officers, every detail of the raid. She did all of this while preparing for her law school exams, her mind now sharper, more focused, fueled by a single-minded pursuit of justice. Her pain became her purpose, but she couldn't do it alone. The police department's internal affairs, a department led by Commander Lena Vance, was already a labyrinth of procedural delays and red tape. Aisha needed a guide. She found one in Dr. Marcus Thorne, a brilliant and deeply respected law professor at her university, a man who specialized in civil rights and police accountability, and who had been a close mentor to her. Dr. Thorne, upon hearing her story, was heartbroken but not surprised. He had seen this story play out 1,000 times, but never with a student as fierce and a motive as clear as Aisha's. He vowed to stand with her. Together, they began to fight. The city's legal department, acting on behalf of the police, immediately offered a settlement, a substantial sum of money in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. It was an attempt to buy her silence, to make the problem go away quietly. Dr. Thorne advised her to take it to avoid the long, painful, and public battle ahead. But Aisha, her dignity already violated, refused. "It's not about the money, Professor," she said, her voice filled with an unwavering resolve. "It's about justice. I won't let them silence me. Not this time." As they began to build their case, meticulously subpoenaing police records and communications, they discovered that the raid on Aisha's apartment wasn't a simple mistake based on a bad tip. It was an act of deliberate intimidation. They found evidence of a false, anonymous tip that was routed through the precinct's computer system, flagged by a superior officer as high priority. This tip, which claimed a gang drug operation was taking place at Aisha's address, was a fabrication. Digging deeper, they found that the tip was sent by Captain David Hayes, the same superior officer who had approved the raid and Officer Miller's reckless tactics. Captain Hayes, a man known for his power-hungry ambition and his disdain for the community student activists, had singled out Aisha's building for his proactive policing, hoping to intimidate the community into silence. The discovery was a gut punch. Aisha wasn't just a victim of a bad cop. She was a target of a corrupt system. Captain Hayes, a man with a hidden agenda, had used her as a pawn in a larger game of power. Now, with Dr. Thorne by her side, she was ready to expose the truth and fight back with the very law she was studying. Aisha's fierce resolve, guided by Dr. Thorne, quickly turned into a formidable legal force. The city's legal department, arrogant and dismissive, assumed they could bury a young law student under a mountain of paperwork. They underestimated Aisha's fierce intellect and her unyielding resolve. Her first court appearance was nothing short of a revelation. She was not a cowering victim, but a poised, brilliant legal warrior, her voice steady as she presented her case. In a tense courtroom scene, she stood face to face with Officer Miller and Captain David Hayes for the first time since the raid. She pointed at Miller, her voice ringing with clarity. "This is the man who kicked me, not once, but twice, for the crime of being a black woman in my own home." The city's lawyer tried to object, but the judge, a woman who had seen it all, allowed Aisha to continue, mesmerized by her conviction. As the lawsuit gained momentum, an anonymous package arrived at Dr. Thorne's office. Inside was a flash drive containing a trove of damning information. It was from a disillusioned officer, a whistleblower named John Rodriguez, who had been an assistant to Captain Hayes. The drive contained internal emails, texts, and a detailed ledger of favors that exposed Hayes' entire corrupt operation. It was a network of false tips, planted evidence, and targeted raids against activists, community leaders, and outspoken citizens. The raid on Aisha's apartment was not a singular event. It was a common tactic used to intimidate anyone who spoke out against the system. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. The whistleblower's information revealed the true, sickening nature of the raid. The false tip that led to Aisha's apartment had been a coordinated effort between Captain Hayes and Officers Miller and Jenkins. But Miller and Jenkins, as it turned out, were the same officers who had beaten another man, an undercover agent, in a park just a few months prior. This connection was no coincidence. Hayes had ordered the raid on Aisha, not just to intimidate her, but as an act of retaliation against Dr. Marcus Thorne, a man who had publicly criticized Hayes' policing policies. They knew Dr. Thorne was a mentor to Aisha, and they were using her as a pawn to send a message to him. The brutal, unprovoked assault on Aisha was a direct act of vengeance, a warning to Dr. Thorne that his activism would have consequences. They hadn't counted on Aisha's unyielding strength. The case, once a local civil rights lawsuit, now exploded into a full-blown federal investigation. Aisha, with Dr. Thorne's guidance, turned her case over to federal prosecutors, who saw in her a witness and a prosecutor of immense power. Her story became a national sensation. She became the face of a movement for justice and police accountability. Her bruised face from that night splashed across news headlines. The people saw her as a hero, a symbol of hope and resilience. The corrupt system had tried to break her, but in doing so, they had given her the platform, the power, and the purpose to bring them down. The case, once a local civil rights lawsuit, now exploded into a full-blown federal investigation. Aisha, with Dr. Thorne's guidance, turned her case over to federal prosecutors, who saw in her a witness and a prosecutor of immense power. Her story became a national sensation. She became the face of a movement for justice and police accountability. Her bruised face from that night splashed across news headlines. The people saw her as a hero, a symbol of hope and resilience. The corrupt system had tried to break her, but in doing so, they had given her the platform, the power, and the purpose to bring them down. The trial of Officer Miller and Captain David Hayes was a landmark event, televised nationwide. Aisha Thorne, no longer just a student, stood on the witness stand, a brilliant and poised legal warrior. Her fierce intellect and unwavering resolve captivated the courtroom as she presented her case. She didn't just talk about the raid. She presented the entire corrupt operation, from the false tips to the whistleblower's ledger. She had become a force of nature, a new kind of power that the system had never seen before. The verdicts were swift and absolute. Officer Miller and Captain David Hayes were found guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, racketeering, and civil rights violations. They received lengthy federal prison sentences, their careers and reputations permanently shattered. But the justice extended far beyond individual convictions. The city, under the guidance of Dr. Marcus Thorne, Aisha's mentor, embarked on a profound and transformative overhaul of its police department. A new, ethically driven police chief was appointed, and a mandatory, independent civilian oversight board with unprecedented powers was established. Aisha Thorne, a hero forged in the crucible of injustice, was offered a position at a prestigious law firm, but she turned it down. Her fight for justice had given her a new purpose. She went on to run for a position as a judge, her story, her brilliance, and her unwavering conviction resonating with every voter. She won in a landslide, becoming the youngest judge in the state's history. Her first case? A civil rights violation filed by a young activist against a corrupt police officer. She handled it with the same quiet strength and unwavering conviction that she had shown in her own case, ensuring that justice was served, and that a new era of police accountability and civil rights had dawned in the city. The corrupt system had tried to break her, but in doing so they had given her the platform, the power, and the purpose to bring them down, and to ensure that justice, true and unyielding, would always prevail. The sound echoed through the packed courtroom like a thunderclap, sealing the fate of Officer Miller and Captain Hayes. Guilty, on every count. Aisha didn't smile. Not yet. She simply exhaled, slow and steady, feeling the weight of years of injustice lift from her shoulders. She glanced toward the public gallery, where her community stood, shoulder to shoulder, fists raised in silent victory. In the front row, Dr. Marcus Thorne gave her a proud nod. Outside, the courthouse steps had become a sea of people. Reporters shoved microphones toward her, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions, but Aisha didn't speak right away. She looked over the crowd, her voice calm but carrying like a drumbeat over the noise. "This victory isn't mine alone," she began. "It belongs to every person who's been told to stay silent. It belongs to every family shattered by abuse of power. Today, the system heard our voices, and it will keep hearing them." The crowd erupted, chanting her name, chanting justice. Months later, in a courtroom of her own, now draped in the black robe of a judge, Aisha sat at the bench. Her first case was a civil rights lawsuit brought by a young activist against a corrupt officer. The parallels were unmistakable. As she listened to the testimony, she remembered the cold floor of her apartment, the sting of Miller's boot, and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. But she also remembered the choice she made that morning to fight. When the verdict came, she leaned forward, her voice firm and resolute. In this courtroom, justice is not a suggestion, it is the law. And today, justice is served. The officer was held accountable. The activists left with their head held high. And from that day forward, every person who entered Aisha Thorne's courtroom knew one unshakable truth. This was a place where no one, not even those in power, was above the law. The system had tried to break her. Instead, it had created its greatest challenger. For more gripping tales from the hidden corners of justice and beyond, subscribe to Dark Side of Luna, where the shadows hold the truth.